The train barreled through the bitterly cold autumn air. Max Diamant, 27, did not know exactly where the train was carrying him, but he was certain the journey would end with his death. It was November 1942 in the country of Poland, and World War II was raging across Europe. Earlier that day, a group of Nazis had forced Max and dozens of other Jewish men, women, and children onto the train at gunpoint. The Nazis didn't tell them the train was going to a death camp, but Max had his suspicions. He knew what the Nazis were capable of. As Max saw it, he had two options: die at the hands of the Nazis or jump from the speeding train. He made his choice. With a pair of pliers he'd hidden in his pocket, Max began feverishly cutting the barbed wire that covered one of the windows. When he'd made a hole large enough, he wiggled through. For a terrifying moment, Max clung to the side of the train with one hand. Wind whipped his hair and clothes. The clanging of the wheels on the metal tracks rang in his ears. And then he let go. Meanwhile, miles away in the city of Przemyśl, 16-year-old Stefania Podgórska was also gripped by fear. She had no idea that her friend Max had been taken, or that his life was in imminent danger. What she did know was that most of her own family was gone, that her food and money were nearly depleted, and that it was up to her to keep herself and her 7-year-old sister Helena alive in a war-torn city. But Stefania would do more than protect her sister. She was about to become a lifeline for Max and 12 other Jewish people. She was about to risk everything to save them all. Stefania was born in 1925 in a small village in Poland. She grew up on a farm. As a young girl, she longed to live in a big city. After Stefania's father passed away in 1938, her mother gave her permission to move to the city with her older sisters. To Stefania, life in the city was more thrilling than she could have imagined. She loved the cobblestone streets, the cafes that served gooey pastries, the shops that sold fancy dresses. She loved the energy of city life, far from the noisy chickens on the farm back home. Stefania soon got a job in a grocery store owned by a kind-hearted woman named Mrs. Leah Diamant. It was there that Stefania first met Max, one of Mrs. Diamant's sons. Max, then 23, was studying to become a dentist. Max's parents treated Fusia, as they affectionately called Stefania, like part of the family. She ate dinner with them often and sometimes stayed in their cozy apartment. Like most Polish people at that time, Stefania was Catholic. The Diamants were Jewish. No doubt, Stefania picked up new words in Yiddish, a language spoken by Jews in Europe. Over time, she probably learned that chutzpah means courage, and that to kvel is to practically faint with pride. She likely knew to say yes when Mrs. Diamant offered her a bissel more cake. But even in the cheerful warmth of the Diamants' home, fear was in the air. As Jews, the Diamants were part of a minority in Poland. Like people of all religions and cultures, Jewish people had their own unique rituals. For example, they worshipped in synagogues on Saturdays, not in churches on Sundays, as Christians did. Many non-Jewish people viewed such differences with mistrust and intolerance. For centuries, anti-Semitism, that is, prejudice against Jewish people, had smoldered in Poland and across Europe. Soon, it would explode into an inferno of violence and death that nobody could have imagined. Next door to Poland was the country of Germany, and every day it was becoming more dangerous for Jewish people. In 1933, when Stefania was still a young girl living on the farm, Adolf Hitler became Germany's leader. At the time, Germany was still suffering from a humiliating defeat in World War I, which had ended in 1918. In the years since, the German people had endured growing poverty, unemployment, and hunger. Hitler and his Nazi party gave Germans someone to blame for these hardships: Jewish people. In hateful speeches, Hitler called Jewish people pests and vermin and a virus, saying they were not human. His vicious lies stirred up old prejudices. By 1938, when Stefania was working for the Diamants, life in Germany had grown unbearable for Jewish people. Nazi laws had stripped them of their rights and dignity. Violent attacks had become common. Many feared far worse was coming. In 1939, Hitler and his armies began invading the countries of Europe, igniting World War II. One by one, Poland and other countries fell to the Nazis. By the time Max leapt from that speeding train in 1942, Germany controlled much of Europe. In the ghetto, people were starving. Diseases spread quickly. Max and his family grew increasingly sick, their clothes hanging from their thinning bodies, their faces turning gaunt. Stefania worried constantly about the Diamants. She began smuggling food and supplies to them through a hole in the ghetto fence: eggs, bread, anything she could get her hands on. She traded her finest clothes for food and became adept at sneaking past guards with rifles. Of course, she knew the risks. The penalty for helping a Jewish person was death. She did it anyway. By 1942, Stefania was the only member of her family still in Przemyśl. Her older sisters had moved away, and other members of her family had been forced to go to Germany to work. Stefania brought her young sister Helena to live with her in Przemyśl. Meanwhile, the Nazis were emptying the ghetto. Every day, more and more people were put on trains bound for death camps or forced labor camps. The Nazis had a dehumanizing term for this: liquidation. Although Stefania and Max may not have fully understood this at the time, the ghettos were part of a Nazi plan to murder every Jewish person in Europe. It's estimated that 6 million Jews were murdered in Nazi death camps. Some 2 million other people were also killed, including communists, homosexuals, people with disabilities, and the Romani, known then as gypsies. History would remember this genocide as the Holocaust. Max's entire family, aside from his younger brother, was murdered by the Nazis. Then, in November 1942, the Nazis came for Max, and that is how he found himself leaping from a speeding train. Max landed in the hard snow and tumbled into a pole. But he was lucky. A loaf of bread he'd managed to hide in his shirt softened the blow and likely saved his life. But where was he supposed to go? The Nazis were in control for hundreds of miles in every direction. Their supporters and spies were everywhere. Keeping to the shadows and desperately hoping he wouldn't get caught, Max stumbled through the snow. About 2 days later, Stefania and Helena were trying to sleep when suddenly there was a knock at the door. The sound filled Stefania with fear. Only the Gestapo, the dreaded Nazi secret police, knocked on doors in the middle of the night. Had they come for her at last? When Stefania opened the door, there stood not the Gestapo, but Max, badly injured and bleeding, his clothes filthy and torn. "Only one night. Please, let me stay," he asked, knowing that every moment he lingered in the apartment, he put the sisters in danger. Stefania and Helena gave him what little food and medicine they had, cleaned him up as best they could, and put him to bed. Then Max had an idea. Why not find a bigger apartment where he and others still trapped in the ghetto could hide? Stefania agreed. She found a cottage on a street named Tatarska. It had no electricity or running water, only an outhouse for going to the bathroom and a well for water. It had 2 rooms, plus a kitchen and an attic, and it would have to do. With Helena's help, Stefania spent 3 days cleaning the cottage and getting it ready. Max was the first to move in. Later, they were joined by Max's brother Henek and Henek's fiancée, Danuta. Eventually, There were 10 adults and 3 children hiding in the cottage on Tatarska Street. Max drew this picture, showing Stefania as an angel looking over the adults hiding in the Tatarska cottage, and Helena as an angel looking over the children. But this story isn't over. Stefania was in a more adverse situation, but there were also others, legendary names that were instrumental in helping her cause and basically getting those kids out, and also trying to establish a strong sense of resilience against the odds. Let's talk about this kid. You probably know Ben Cam, the boy with big ideas and a quick smile, the one who will lead you off on an adventure and make sure you get home safely. Ben grew up in a different place and time than you, in Warsaw, Poland, in the 1920s and 30s. But he was enough like you and your friends that you should be able to picture him, short but strong, his clothes rumpled from wrestling with his little brothers, his eyes bright blue. Try to imagine him running through the crowded city streets with his friends, zigzagging around finely dressed ladies and fruit sellers and men with long gray beards. You can hear him laughing with his friends and shouting goodbyes as they all head home for dinner. But wait, do you hear that too? As Ben walks by a neighbor, the man hisses something. Dirty Jew. Ben's skin prickles, but he doesn't glance at the man. The truth is that he is used to these words. Anti-Semitism, prejudice against Jewish people, is a fact of life in Warsaw, as it is in many European cities. Like most of Warsaw's 350,000 Jews, Ben doesn't dwell on the petty hatreds of ignorant people. The man's words are like the cold wind that blows off the nearby Vistula River. Ben shivers for a few moments, but he holds his head up and keeps walking. He quickly forgets about this man. Keep picturing Ben in your mind as he walks up to his spacious apartment, where his 4 little brothers happily pounce on him, where his father looks up from his evening paper and smiles, where his mother serves a delicious dinner in their cozy dining room. This is where Ben's story takes a sharp turn into one of the darkest and most evil chapters in history, the Holocaust. As Ben's family is enjoying their dinner, Germany's leader Adolf Hitler is plotting the annihilation of Europe's 9.5 million Jews. Germany had been struggling since 1918 when it was defeated in World War I. The German people felt humiliated, tired, and bitter. Hitler and his Nazi party rose to power by tapping into these feelings. Hitler declared that Germans were superior to everyone else. He also offered up a scapegoat for all of Germany's problems: Jewish people. In his speeches and writings, Hitler attacked Europe's Jews. He compared them to vermin, calling them subhuman and an inferior race. These words fanned the flames of centuries-old bigotry against Jewish people, whose religion and rituals had often kept them separate from the rest of the population. "Eliminate the Jews," Hitler proclaimed, "and you will eliminate all of Germany's problems." As Hitler's influence spread across Europe, many people turned against their Jewish neighbors. Synagogues were destroyed, Jewish-owned businesses were vandalized or burned to the ground. By 1945, 6 million Jewish men, women, and children would be dead. Nazi troops and their collaborators shot them, starved them, worked them to death, and systematically murdered them in the gas chambers of death camps. But in the days before World War II, when the Cams were happy and comfortable, nobody could conceive of such horrors. Who could imagine such things? Ben would say decades later. Who could imagine? Ben was 18 when, in 1939, German troops invaded Poland. With shocking swiftness and brutal efficiency, the Nazis and Polish police persecuted Warsaw's Jews. Many Jewish-owned businesses were seized. Jews were not allowed to set foot in public parks or libraries, or go out after 5 p.m. Anyone who violated these laws could be shot on the spot. The Kamm family often spoke about leaving Poland, but they had nowhere to go. Germany was at war with England and France, and the Nazis controlled a vast expanse of Europe. All the borders were closed. Then, starting on October 12, 1940, all the Jewish people in Warsaw and its surrounding towns were rounded up and forced to move into one tiny area of the city. The area, which became known as the Warsaw Ghetto, was surrounded by a 10-foot wall topped with barbed wire and broken glass. Armed police herded hundreds of Jews through the streets. Ben looked with sorrow at those around him, women holding tight to their babies, men in business suits, teachers from his school, little girls wearing their fanciest shoes and dresses. A well-known musician carried only his violin. No one was permitted to bring more than a few belongings. Ben saw a sneering policeman shove an old woman who lagged behind the crowd. The policeman's eyes were filled with disgust. Ben gripped his youngest brother's hand, his heart pounding with fear and resentment. The Nazis and their sympathizers, he realized, did not see them as humans. He felt like an animal, a helpless animal. Some 400,000 Jews were crammed into the ghetto. Ben's family moved into one small room. The gates to the ghetto closed. Nobody was allowed to leave. Rage at the Nazis burned inside Ben as conditions in the ghetto became increasingly deplorable. One day, a policeman drove through the streets with a smile on his face, firing his gun. He killed a pregnant woman. An epidemic of typhus swept through the crowded apartments, killing thousands innocent people. Bodies piled up in the streets. Each resident was allotted a tiny ration of food that was barely a tenth of what a person should eat each day. Like many young people, Ben soon learned tricks for sneaking out of the ghetto to find food for his family. There were holes in the wall and tunnels that led to the other side. With his blonde hair and blue eyes, Ben blended in easily with the rest of the Polish population. Plus, he had an aunt on the outside. None of her neighbors knew she was Jewish, and she managed to help Ben without attracting suspicion. Even with his aunt's help, though, Ben and his family were slowly starving. They could do nothing, it seemed, except wait for death. But Ben would soon learn that he could do something after all, if he dared. Tens of thousands of people, including thousands of Jews, were fighting back against the Nazis. They were called partisans. Like characters out of Robin Hood, they operated from bases hidden deep in the thick forests of Eastern Europe. Some were hardened fighters, others were teenagers, mostly boys, but a few girls as well. They blew up factories, sabotaged railroads, stole weapons shipments, and upset the flow of supplies to German troops. In several partisan forest camps, fighters also protected large numbers of Jewish families who had escaped the ghettos. The most famous partisan group was commanded by the Bielskis, 3 Jewish brothers who had fled the Novgorod ghetto in Belarusia, now Belarus, after the Nazis murdered their family. The brothers fought German troops and ran sabotage missions, though their focus was protecting a community of around 1,200 Jewish men, women, and children. Stories about partisans like the Bielskis spread through the Warsaw Ghetto, offering a glint of hope to boys like Ben. One day, Ben's aunt told him about a Polish partisan group in a forest 100 miles away. With his family's blessing, Ben snuck out and joined up. Ben struggled to adjust to life with the partisans. He had to learn to shoot, to fall asleep on the cold forest ground, to endure days in rain-soaked clothing, and to ambush Polish policemen and steal their weapons. Danger lurked everywhere in the hostile countryside, where Poles could earn rewards for turning in Jews to the Nazis. But Ben's rage had toughened him. His bravery and skill soon earned him the respect of the most experienced fighters. A few months after joining the partisans, Ben received word that his family was in trouble. He rushed back to Warsaw and was shocked by what he found in the ghetto. Orphaned children begged in the streets. The dead lay slumped in doorways. His family was living in despair, sharing their single room with 3 other families. Each week, the police rounded up more people to work as slave laborers. None returned. There were terrible rumors about Nazi death camps, where Jews were being murdered in gas chambers. Ben stayed in the Warsaw ghetto for 2 days, sneaking in and out to steal food for his family. He considered taking his brothers back to the forest with him, but many in the ghetto believed the war would soon be over, that the Soviet army, now at war with Germany, would crush Hitler's troops and free them from their ghetto prison. Ben's parents believed the younger boys would be safer in the ghetto. For the rest of his life, Ben would break down in tears when he recalled the moment he left to rejoin the partisans. He would never see his family again. For the next 2 years, Ben fought with a legendary band of partisans commanded by a former Soviet general. Their group eventually grew to 1,600 fighters operating from a large compound in the forest. The compound became like a town, with cobblers who repaired shoes and musicians who provided moments of joyful escape. On a chilly April morning in 1939, 14-year-old Laura Sulzbacher sat alone in an enormous train station in London. All around her, people were talking, but Laura didn't know what they were saying. She didn't speak a word of English. Laura clutched her only possessions: a suitcase filled with clothes and photographs and her accordion, a musical instrument she loved to play. She wondered what was going to happen to her. Only a few days earlier, Laura's parents had said they were sending her away. Germany, where Laura lived, had become dangerous for Jewish people like them. Laura's parents were among thousands of Jewish parents across Germany, Austria, and Czechoslovakia who were sending their kids, some less than a year old, to Britain to live with strangers. They were all part of a desperate plan to save the lives of thousands of children. As Laura waited in the station that cold April morning, doubt crept into her mind. She didn't know the family that had volunteered to take her in, not even their names. What sort of people would they be? Would they be kind? Terror washed over her. Why did her parents have to send her away? Germany hadn't always been dangerous for Jewish people. In Fürth, the charming city where Laura grew up, Jewish and non-Jewish Germans lived and worked alongside one another. Still, life in Germany in the 1920s wasn't easy. Germany had recently suffered a humiliating defeat in the First World War. The German economy had collapsed, and unemployment had skyrocketed. Then, in the early 1930s, Adolf Hitler rose to power. Hitler promised to make Germany strong again. He also gave Germans someone to blame for their problems: Jewish people. Prejudice against Jewish people, or anti-Semitism, had long existed in Europe. Many regarded Jewish people, with their different religion, customs, and rituals, with confusion and mistrust. Hitler fanned the flames of these centuries-old suspicions. In taverns and meeting halls, he delivered hateful speeches denouncing Jewish people. He called them subhuman and said they were corrupting all of Europe. They were the pests of the world, he said. These speeches were filled with lies, but many embittered Germans listened with eager ears. In 1933, when Hitler became chancellor, that is, the head of the German government, his racist beliefs shaped new laws that made life harder and harder for Jewish people. Over the next 5 years, Hitler and his Nazi party stripped German Jews of their rights and ostracized them from society. Jewish people were fired from their jobs and forbidden to vote. Friends and neighbors turned cold and cruel. Some shouted racist insults at the Jewish members of their communities or threw stones at them. Signs appeared in windows of restaurants and shops that said Jews not wanted. Sometimes Jewish people were beaten in the streets. By the time Laura was 12, she could no longer swim in public pools or go to the movies or even walk through public parks, just because she was Jewish. Yet many German Jews believed that the terror would soon end. After all, they had weathered anti-Semitic hostilities before. Many felt sure that their country would come to its senses, that Hitler would be ousted. This lunatic couldn't possibly last much longer, Laura remembers her parents saying, but that hope was soon shattered. On the night of November 9th, 1938, in cities and towns across Germany, Austria, and parts of Czechoslovakia, large mobs organized by the Nazis unleashed terrible violence. Jewish homes, schools, and synagogues were burned to the ground. Jewish stores were looted and destroyed. This night of violent attacks came to be known as Kristallnacht, or the Night of Broken Glass. After that, Laura and her parents accepted the terrible truth. Their country, the only home they'd ever known, was no longer safe for them. As news of Kristallnacht spread, people around the world were horrified, yet few countries were willing to open their doors to those trying to escape Hitler. At the time, millions of people in Europe and the US were struggling to find work and feed their families. Many countries, including the US, argued that a wave of newcomers from Germany would compete for scarce jobs. But in Britain, a group of Jewish and non-Jewish advocates for refugees was determined to do something. They figured if they couldn't get entire families out, maybe they could at least save the children. They appealed to the British government to take action. Here is a chance of taking the young generation of a great people. Here is a chance of mitigating to some extent the terrible suffering of their parents and their friends, British Home Secretary Samuel Hoare said in a debate over what should be done. On November 22nd, the British government voted in favor of helping child refugees, and in the coming days, a complex rescue operation would take shape. This operation would be called the Kindertransport. Kinder means children in German. It was decided that Jewish children under age 17 could receive special travel documents to come to Britain, where they would be placed in foster homes, boarding houses, or hostels. £50, about $1,500 today, had to be set aside for each child to pay for their eventual return to Germany after the crisis ended. The money often came from sponsors or the children's parents. On November 25th, British radio aired a call for volunteers. Soon after, more than 500 people had offered their homes to young refugees. Meanwhile, representatives traveled to Germany and Austria to set up systems for organizing and transporting the children. In March 1939, Hitler's army invaded Czechoslovakia, and transports for Jewish children were quickly organized there as well. Now, parents in Nazi-occupied countries faced an agonizing decision: send their children to live with total strangers in a far-off country to keep them safe from Nazi terror, or keep their families together and try to survive the violence. December 1st, 1938, just a few weeks after Kristallnacht, the first train of the Kindertransport left Germany for England. By early 1939, nearly 300 children were arriving in England every week. On April 14th, 1939, Laura's mom and dad told her that they had arranged a place for her on the Kindertransport. Laura would have only 4 days to get ready to leave. The rules were strict. Laura was allowed 1 suitcase, 1 piece of hand luggage, and 10 marks, about $70 today. The Nazis didn't want anything of value to leave Germany. At the train station, Laura's parents insisted they would see her again. As the train hauled itself out of the station, all Laura could do was stare out the window until her mom and dad disappeared from sight. Most children arrived in England with little idea of what lay in store for them. Often, they didn't even know the names of their foster families. They waited at train stations to be picked up, wearing numbers around their necks so they could be identified. Children who didn't have foster families were sent to boarding houses or hostels. When Laura arrived in London, A couple appeared and introduced themselves as Mr. and Mrs. Schreiber. Lore didn't understand much of what they said, but she went with them to their home in the city of Lincoln. The Schreibers and the people of Lincoln did their best to help Lore. The Schreibers gave her a bed to sleep in and food to eat, and they sent her to school to learn English. Their 17-year-old son quickly accepted Lore as a sister, and the two became close friends. At school, kids invited Lore to play cricket, one of England's most popular sports. Lore didn't know the rules, but the kids made sure she knew when to run. Despite these kindnesses, Lore was homesick and felt like an outsider. She wasn't used to English, food, and customs. School was hard. Her classmates didn't speak German, and she struggled to understand the lessons. On top of everything, Lore worried about her parents. They wrote often, sometimes more than once a week. In one letter, her father told her to be strong, keep your head up high. Like many Kindertransport children, Lore felt it was her responsibility to try to get her loved ones out of Germany. She did manage to find guardians in England for 2 friends and a cousin, but getting her mom and dad out was more difficult. She knew the rule. If she could find jobs for her parents in England, they would be allowed to come. In her spare time, Lore walked around Lincoln looking for the biggest homes, the ones sure to be owned by wealthy people. She knocked on doors and put her broken English to work. "Do you need a gardener? A cook?" she would ask. Eventually, Lore found a family willing to help. They said they would hire Lore's parents and sent an application to the British government. Lore felt sure her family would soon be reunited. Then, on September 1st, 1939, dreadful news arrived. Germany had invaded Poland. Britain was forming an alliance with other countries in Europe to fight Hitler. World War II had begun. The start of World War II put an end to the Kindertransport in Germany. For Lore and the other children, the dream of seeing their families was crushed. Most communication stopped, though Lore was able to get snippets of news about her parents through a relative in Switzerland. Through the difficult years of the war, Lore tried to make the best of life in England. She learned to sew while working in the dress shops the Schreibers owned. She also took art classes at night. After all, this is what her parents had wanted for her, to live her life, to thrive. But the grim realities of war were ever present. German warplanes rained bombs on England. German tanks rolled through Western Europe, Belgium, the Netherlands, France. It seemed that Hitler could not be stopped. When Lore turned 18 in 1943, she said goodbye to the Schreibers and joined the British Army. "I felt I was saying thank you to England for saving my life," she would later say. Lore was posted to London and given a job as a driver. She made many new friends. For the first time, she felt like she truly belonged. "The people on my left, the people on my right," she recalled. "We were all the same." In 1941, the U.S. joined the fight against Germany. The war raged on for 4 more years, until finally, in April 1945, Germany surrendered. After the war, hundreds of Kindertransport children found one or both of their parents. But most never saw their parents again. Few Jewish people in Nazi-occupied countries survived. Tragically, Lore's parents were killed in a Nazi death camp called Auschwitz. They were among the 6 million Jewish men, women, and children the Nazis murdered. This atrocity would later be known as the Holocaust. Many decades later, Lore sat down to tell her story to an interviewer. She still dreamed about her parents. Sometimes in her dreams, her father is carrying her piggyback through a park in Firth. Despite everything that she lost, Lore seemed to look back on her life with a sense of gratitude. After the war, she had a son, 3 grandsons, and a marriage as happy as her parents had been. To get back to Stefania, she had the same ending, but a more resounding one. For the next 2 years, while Stefania and Helena lived downstairs, the group lived in the tiny attic above as quietly as they could. They went to the bathroom in a bucket that Helena emptied into the outhouse at night. Max built a false wall in the attic to hide behind when needed. It was up to Stefania to feed everyone. She got a job in a factory and used her earnings, along with whatever she could trade, to buy food. When shop owners grew suspicious of how much food she bought, she alternated the stores she went to or sent Helena, who was too young to arouse suspicion. Stefania was exhausted all the time, but she pressed on. During those long years, there were many close calls. The worst was when an officer showed up and told Stefania he was seizing the cottage for army nurses who were coming to work in the German hospital across the street. Stefania had 2 hours to leave, he said, or she'd be shot. Max and the others begged Stefania to take Helena and flee, to save herself. But she refused to abandon them and prayed for help instead. At the last moment, the officer changed his mind and allowed Stefania to stay as long as 2 German nurses could move into one of the rooms. And so for 6 months, the nurses lived downstairs with Stefania and Helena, while Max and the others lived in the attic. One sneeze, one stumble, one creaky floorboard away from being caught. Max would stay awake at night, gently waking anyone who snored. Many years later, Stefania returned to the cottage on Tatarska Street. Here, she stands in the attic, where 13 Jewish men, women, and children hid for 2 years. The building is now being restored and turned into a museum. In 1945, Germany was at last defeated by the Allied forces of the United States, Great Britain, Canada, and Russia. World War II soon came to an end. Hundreds of cities and towns were in ruins. In addition to the millions of victims of the Holocaust, it's estimated that some 80 million men, women, and children were killed in bombings, in combat, and by disease. Every Jewish person Stefania sheltered during those long and difficult years had survived. But that wasn't the end of the story for Stefania and Max. It was the beginning of a new one. After the war, the two got married. They looked after Helena until she went to college. Eventually, they immigrated to the US, where Max had a successful career as a dentist. They had 2 children. Helena became a doctor and settled in Poland. In 1979, Stefania and Helena were named Righteous Among Nations by Yad Vashem, the World Holocaust Remembrance Center. This great honor recognizes those who helped Jewish people during the Holocaust. The rest of Stefania's family survived the war, but they never accepted Stefania's marriage to a Jewish person, and they disowned her and Helena for harboring Jewish people during the war. Tragically, even after the Holocaust, anti-Semitism continued to fester in Poland and other countries. Max passed away in 2003, and Stefania passed away in 2018. During Stefania's life, she was interviewed many times about what she did as a teenager. She never expressed regret for the extraordinary risks she took. What Stefania did say was that given the choice, she would do it all again. The Light in Hidden Places by Sharon Cameron is a new novel based on Stefania's life. This excerpt takes place after Stefania witnessed a Nazi officer commit murder in the ghetto. For the first time, I understood what I was facing. Before, it had been easy to imagine that all these terrible things were some kind of mistake. The misguided ideas of a misguided leader who in turn was misguiding his army and his people. Hadn't there always been people who were poor and hungry? People who were hated and despised? Hadn't there always been wars where the young men fought and the innocent died? It was horrible, and it was the world. But that was not what I saw in that officer's face. What I saw was the joy of hate. the happiness of causing another person's death and pain. What I saw was evil, and every part of me defied it.